Hello everyone and God bless you. I have something special for you in this video. I am going to recall to you 10 of the most incredible miracles found in the Bible. Not only that, but I'll narrate them to you in a way to help you fall into a deep and restful sleep. So, make sure to leave this video playing until the end. I have set it to a dark screen with no distractions, and you'll hear the gentle rain sound in the background to help you relax. I will also pray over you at the end of this video. Before we get going, I wonder if I could ask for one thing? Could you quickly subscribe to our channel, please? This helps us to grow, to reach more people, to spread the word of God and the love of Jesus. Thank you. Okay. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin the story of our first incredible miracle. Chapter 1. The Parting of the Red Sea. It was a night cloaked in uncertainty, with the scent of freedom and fear lingering in the air. The Israelites, a people newly liberated from generations of slavery, traveled by faith through a wilderness that stretched endlessly before them. Each step they took seemed to echo the past, their feet treading lightly yet urgently across the sands of a new journey. Families moved together, their eyes reflecting both hope and trepidation, the promise of liberation mingling with the shadows of doubt. Ahead of them was the leader chosen by God, Moses, a man who had once fled Egypt but now returned as a vessel of divine deliverance. His eyes were resolute, but his heart carried the weight of the responsibility placed upon him. He had seen the hand of God work through the plagues that softened Pharaoh's hardened heart. He had watched as chains were broken and gates swung open, and yet the path ahead was not yet clear. The sky was painted with a deepening twilight, and a sense of apprehension hung heavy among the people. They were free, but freedom can be a fragile thing. Behind them lay Egypt, a place of cruelty and bondage, now a distant land fading into the shadows. Yet as much as they longed to look forward, there was still a fear that the past could catch up with them. The path they took led them toward the Red Sea, its expanse vast and unyielding, its waters reflecting the soft glow of the moon. The gentle waves whispered secrets only the sea could know, an eternal song of depths unexplored. The air was cool, the breeze a gentle caress against weary faces. As they drew closer to the sea, a stillness settled over the people. Mothers held their children close, whispering words of comfort. Fathers cast their eyes to the horizon, searching for direction. And Moses, staff in hand, looked to the heavens, knowing that their journey was not yet complete. But then, behind them, a sound began to rise, a low rumble that grew louder, more insistent. The sound of wheels, of hooves pounding the earth, of voices shouting. Panic rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind. They turned and saw the impossible: Pharaoh's army, chariots gleaming, horses charging, soldiers determined to reclaim what they had lost. The dust of their pursuit rose like a cloud, a looming reminder of the life the Israelites thought they had escaped. Fear surged through the people, a wave of dread that threatened to engulf them. Voices rose in despair. Why did we leave Egypt? Were there not enough graves there for us to die? Why did you bring us out here to perish in the wilderness? Their hope trembled, teetering on the edge of despair. Moses, steady and unwavering, stood before them. His voice, though calm, carried an authority not his own. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. A stillness settled over them, a fragile peace amidst the rising storm. The wind whispered through the camp, carrying the weight of those words. Could it be true? Could they trust in the unseen, even when the seen threatened to destroy them? God spoke to Moses, his voice a quiet yet commanding presence in the stillness of the night. Tell the Israelites to move forward. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. With hands steady and heart anchored in faith, Moses lifted his staff, and as he did, a wind began to stir, a strong, steady wind that swept across the waters of the Red Sea. The breeze grew stronger, swirling, parting the waters like a seam being opened by invisible hands. The waves, which had once moved in unison, now stood apart, rising into towering walls on either side. Between them lay a path of dry ground, stretching into the distance, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. A collective breath caught in the throats of the people. They stared, wide-eyed, at the impossible miracle before them. The sea, which moments ago seemed to imprison them, now offered a way forward. It was as though the very heart of creation had opened to make a way for them. The air was filled with the sound of water held at bay, a sound both quiet and mighty, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Moses turned to the people, his voice low and firm. "Go now. Walk through the sea. The Lord is with us." One by one, they stepped forward. Hesitant at first, then with growing courage. Mothers carried their children, fathers held their loved ones close, elders leaned on staffs, their eyes glimmering with awe. The path felt solid beneath their feet, the ground dry and firm. The walls of water stood like sentinels on either side, the dark depths kept at bay by the unseen hand of God. The sound of the wind and the whisper of the water accompanied them, a symphony of deliverance. Hearts beat with a rhythm of hope, steps fell into a steady march of faith. They walked, guided by the light of God's presence, the cloud of His glory standing behind them, shielding them from the relentless army that pursued. But Pharaoh's chariots, driven by pride and desperation, did not falter. They charged into the path, their wheels grinding the dry seabed, their horses neighing in confusion. The walls of water seemed to loom higher, the air thick with divine judgment. As the army pressed forward, their wheels began to falter, to stick in the ground, to twist and turn. Panic spread through the ranks, and shouts of fear replaced the cries of pursuit. "The Lord is fighting for them," they cried. "Let us turn back." But it was too late. The Israelites reached the far shore, their feet touching solid ground, their hearts pounding with the reality of their deliverance. Moses, standing firm, lifted his staff once more. The wind ceased. The walls of water, held back by divine will, now roared back into place. The sea closed over Pharaoh's army, the waves swallowing them in a rush of finality. Silence followed, the deep, quiet silence of a sea at rest. The Israelites stood on the other shore, the weight of what they had witnessed settling into their hearts. Their pursuers were gone, their chains forever broken. The sea, which had seemed an obstacle, had become a vessel of salvation. Tears fell, hands lifted, and voices rose in praise. Then Moses' sister, Miriam, took a tambourine in her hand, and the women followed her with tambourines and dancing. "Sing to the Lord," she sang, her voice a thread of joy woven into the night. "For He is highly exalted. Both horse and driver He has hurled into the sea." The people of Israel, once slaves, now stood as a people redeemed. They had walked through the depths of the sea and emerged into the light of freedom. The journey was far from over, but the God who had parted the waters would guide them still. In the quiet of the night, with the sea behind them and the wilderness before them, they rested. The rain fell gently, a reminder of God's sustaining presence. And as they closed their eyes, the sound of waves, the memory of deliverance, and the promise of a faithful God surrounded them like a blanket of peace. The Lord had fought for them, and they were free. Chapter 2. The Feeding of the 5,000. The day was long, and the sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden hues across the rolling hills of Galilee. A gentle breeze brushed the faces of the crowd who had gathered, carrying with it the scent of nearby grasses and the faint tang of the sea. The people had followed Jesus for hours, their feet dusty from the journey, their hearts full of curiosity, wonder, and a deep need for something more. They had heard of Him, the teacher, the healer, the man who spoke of the kingdom of God with a depth and authority no one else possessed. Many had witnessed His miracles, the blind receiving sight, the lame walking, the sick made whole. Others had come because of whispered stories, eager to see for themselves if this man from Nazareth was truly sent by God. The crowd swelled in numbers, a sea of faces reflecting hope, weariness, and longing. There were men and women, the young and the old, families clutching their children, and elders leaning on their staffs. They had left behind their villages, their fields, and their homes, drawn by a desire that went beyond explanation. There was something about Jesus, a presence that quieted their fears, a voice that called to something deep within them. Jesus had spent the day teaching, his words weaving stories of hope and promise. His voice, though gentle, carried easily over the hills. He spoke of God's love, of mercy and forgiveness, of a kingdom where the broken are healed and the weary find rest. Each word seemed to settle over the crowd like a soft rain, refreshing their souls and lifting the weight of their burdens. As the afternoon faded into evening, a quiet hunger began to gnaw at the edges of their awareness. Mothers glanced at their children, whose eyes reflected both exhaustion and hunger. Fathers looked around, wondering where they might find food in this desolate place. They were far from the villages now, in a remote area where the land stretched empty and open. Jesus, aware of their needs, turned to his disciples. His eyes, filled with compassion, surveyed the crowd. He knew their hunger, not just for food, but for nourishment of body and spirit. "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" he asked gently, knowing the answer before the question was formed. Philip, one of his disciples, looked out over the vast crowd, his brow furrowing in concern. "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have just a bite," he replied, his voice tinged with worry. The sheer number of people made the task seem impossible. Another disciple, Andrew, stepped forward. He gestured toward a young boy standing nearby, his eyes wide and curious. In the boy's hands was a small bundle, a modest meal of 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. The boy's grip was tight, as though he sensed the importance of what he held. "Here is a boy with 5 small loaves and 2 fish," Andrew said. "But how far will they go among so many?" The air was thick with uncertainty. The loaves were small, simple rounds of bread baked by loving hands. The fish were no more than dried, salted pieces, meant for a single meal. How could this meager offering feed thousands? But Jesus' face was serene, his eyes alight with a quiet confidence. He smiled at the boy, who slowly extended his hands, offering all he had. There was no hesitation, no holding back. Just a simple, childlike faith. "Have the people sit down," Jesus said. The disciples moved through the crowd, encouraging them to settle on the soft grass. The people sat in groups, the evening light casting a warm glow over their expectant faces. The breeze softened, and a hush fell over the hillside, a stillness that seemed to cradle the moment in gentle hands. Jesus took the loaves and the fish from the boy, his hands holding the small offering with reverence. He looked up to heaven, his eyes reflecting the endless sky, and gave thanks. His voice was soft but clear, a prayer of gratitude that seemed to echo beyond the hills, reaching into the very heart of creation. Then he began to break the loaves, his hands moving with a rhythm both deliberate and gentle. He gave pieces to the disciples, who turned and distributed the bread to the people. They moved among the crowd, hands outstretched, offering bread and fish. The people took the food with quiet awe, the scent of the freshly broken loaves mingling with the cool evening air. And something incredible began to happen. The bread did not run out. The fish did not dwindle. The disciples returned again and again to Jesus, their arms filled with food, their eyes wide with wonder. Each time they thought the supply would surely end, they found more, as though the bread and fish flowed from a source unseen, limitless in its provision. The people ate, their hunger easing with each bite. The bread was warm and satisfying, the fish salty and rich. Laughter began to ripple through the crowd, soft conversations blooming like flowers after a rain. Children leaned against their mothers, their bellies full and their eyes heavy with contentment. The worry that had clouded the day lifted, replaced by a peace that settled deep in their bones. Time seemed to slow, the sky shifting to a deep indigo as stars began to wink into existence. The hillside, once filled with hunger and uncertainty, was now a place of abundance and joy. The miracle was not just in the food but in the way it touched each heart. They were seen, they were cared for, they were loved. When everyone had eaten their fill, Jesus turned to his disciples once more. "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." The disciples moved through the crowd, gathering the remaining pieces of bread and fish. Basket after basket was filled, until 12 baskets brimmed with leftovers, far more than the humble meal they had started with. The abundance was undeniable, a testament to the generosity of God's provision. The people marveled, their hearts full of gratitude. This man, this teacher, was more than they had imagined. He had fed their bodies, but he had also fed their souls. Their hunger, both physical and spiritual, had been satisfied in a way that defied explanation. As the crowd slowly dispersed, their steps were lighter, their spirits lifted. They returned to their homes carrying the memory of that evening, the taste of bread and fish lingering on their tongues, the warmth of hope nestled in their hearts. Jesus watched them go, his face serene. He knew this miracle was more than just the feeding of a crowd. It was a glimpse of the kingdom of God, a kingdom where abundance flows from trust, where a small offering becomes a feast, where no one is left hungry. The night deepened, and the gentle rain began to fall, a quiet patter on the grass, a lullaby for a weary world. The story of the loaves and fish, of provision and compassion, settled into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And as they lay down to sleep, the sound of rain and the memory of the miracle wove together, a soft reminder that God provides, that He sees, and that His love is ever present, like a steady, calming rain. Chapter 3. The Raising of Lazarus. It was a day soaked in sadness. The sun hung low, its light filtered through the swaying branches of olive trees, casting soft shadows across the quiet village of Bethany. A stillness hung in the air, broken only by muffled sobs and the quiet shuffling of footsteps. In this small village just outside of Jerusalem, grief had settled over one home like a thick, heavy blanket. This was the home of Lazarus, and his sisters, Mary and Martha. The household that had once been filled with laughter, hospitality, and warmth now carried the weight of loss. Lazarus, their beloved brother, had fallen ill. The illness had come quickly, stealing his strength and his breath with an unrelenting grip. The sisters had watched, helpless, their hearts aching as the one they loved grew weaker. In their desperation, they had sent a message to Jesus, their teacher, their friend. "Lord, the one you love is sick." They knew Jesus could heal. They had seen His miracles, His power to make the blind see, the lame walk, and the sick well again. Hope flickered like a candle in the darkness. If Jesus came, Lazarus could be saved. But the days stretched long, and Jesus did not arrive. The sisters' hope faded, and their hearts grew heavy with confusion and sorrow. They had waited and watched until there was nothing left to do but weep. Lazarus took his final breath, and the house filled with the hollow stillness of grief. Their brother was gone, and with him, a piece of their hearts. Friends and mourners gathered, offering comfort and companionship in the days that followed. The air was thick with the scent of spices and the low hum of prayers. Tears flowed freely, each one a testament to the love that had been shared, the bond that death had now broken. It was on the fourth day that word came: Jesus was near. He was approaching Bethany. The news stirred something deep within Martha, a spark of hope mingled with anguish. She rose quickly and left the house, her steps urgent as she went to meet him on the road. When she saw Jesus, her voice trembled with emotion, her eyes searching his face. "Lord," she said, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her words carried the weight of her grief, yet beneath them was a thread of faith that refused to be broken. Jesus looked at her, his eyes filled with compassion, his voice steady and gentle. "Your brother will rise again." Martha nodded, her voice soft. "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus' next words were a promise, a truth that cut through the veil of grief. "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Her eyes shimmered with tears, and her voice caught as she whispered, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Martha turned back to the house, her heart beating with a strange mixture of sorrow and hope. She found her sister Mary and, leaning close, whispered, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." Mary rose quickly, her grief heavy on her shoulders. She walked to Jesus, her steps weighed down by sorrow. When she saw him, she fell at his feet, her sobs escaping like waves crashing against the shore. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her tears mingled with the dust, a reflection of her broken heart. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the mourners who had come with her, his spirit was deeply moved, his heart filled with pain. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they replied. As he walked with them, the tears began to flow. The Son of God, the one who held the universe in his hands, wept with them. His tears fell like gentle rain, mingling with their grief, a testament to his deep love and compassion. They came to the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. The air was cool and still, the weight of death pressing heavily upon them. Jesus spoke softly but firmly. "Take away the stone." Martha's voice trembled with hesitation. "But Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Her mind grappled with the reality of death, the finality of the grave. Jesus met her eyes, his voice a gentle reminder. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The stone was rolled away, the scrape of rock against rock echoing in the stillness. The entrance to the tomb lay open, a dark void, a symbol of everything they feared. The air was tense, hearts beat quickly, breaths were held. Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven, his voice calm and clear. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Then, with a voice that carried authority over life and death, he called out, "Lazarus, come out!" For a moment there was only silence, a silence that stretched into eternity. Then, from the darkness of the tomb, a figure appeared. Wrapped in burial cloths, his face covered, his steps slow and hesitant, Lazarus emerged, alive. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide with astonishment, their hearts pounding with disbelief and joy. Jesus smiled gently, his voice tender. "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Tears of grief turned to tears of joy. Shouts of praise rose like a song, a chorus of wonder and thanksgiving. Martha and Mary rushed to their brother, their hands touching his face, his hands, his shoulders, unable to believe that he was truly there. The one who had been lost to them, the one whose absence had left a void, was now returned. Lazarus stood among them, blinking in the light, breathing the cool air, his heart beating with the rhythm of a new life. The crowd murmured in awe, whispers of the impossible made real. This man, Jesus, had brought the dead to life. He had spoken, and death had retreated. The miracle was undeniable, a testament to Jesus' power over the grave, his authority as the giver of life. And yet, it was more than just a display of power. It was an expression of love, of compassion, of God's deep desire to bring life where there is death, hope where there is despair. As the sun set over Bethany, the golden light spread softly across the village, touching every heart that had witnessed the miracle. The sound of gentle weeping gave way to quiet laughter, the laughter of hearts made whole again. In that moment, the world felt a little brighter, the shadows a little less daunting. Jesus had shown them, and us, that even in the darkest moments, even in the face of death, there is hope. There is a promise that life does not end in the tomb, that love is stronger than death, and that the voice of God can call forth life from the shadows. The rain began to fall gently, each drop a reminder of God's presence, His grace, and His endless love. And as the people returned to their homes, their hearts full and their spirits lifted, they carried with them the memory of a miracle that whispered of life, of hope, and of a love that never lets go. Chapter 4. Jesus walks on water. It was a night shrouded in darkness, the kind that pressed in from all sides, muffling the world in a blanket of quiet uncertainty. The Sea of Galilee stretched wide and restless beneath a moonless sky, its waters reflecting only the faintest glimmers of distant stars. A cool wind whispered across the surface, growing in strength as the hours crept by. The gentle lap of waves slowly gave way to the rhythmic surge of water churned by an unseen force. Somewhere in the heart of this vast and swelling sea, a small boat strained against the waves. The disciples, weary and soaked from the effort, worked the oars with a determination born of necessity. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, their hearts troubled by the storm that now surrounded them. The wind was against them, fierce and unrelenting, and their journey across the lake felt endless. Earlier that day, the sun had shone bright and warm. The air had been filled with joy and wonder as they witnessed the miracle of Jesus feeding over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. The crowd had been amazed, and their own hearts were buoyed with excitement and awe. But now, with night falling and the storm rising, that joy seemed a distant memory, like a light obscured by thick clouds. Jesus had sent them ahead, telling them to cross to the other side while he stayed behind to dismiss the crowd. Then, he had gone up the mountainside alone to pray. The thought of him, quiet and serene on the mountain, contrasted sharply with their current struggle against the wind and waves. The sea seemed to mock their efforts, the wind pushing them back each time they fought to move forward. Hours passed. The night grew darker, the wind colder, the sea more hostile. The disciples' muscles ached, their minds clouded with fatigue. They felt small and vulnerable, at the mercy of the storm's relentless force. Hope flickered, dimmed by fear and uncertainty. The waves slapped the sides of the boat, each surge a reminder of how far they still had to go. As the night wore on, their world narrowed to the immediate struggle. The pull of the oars, the sting of salt water on their skin, the sound of the wind in their ears. Their minds swam with exhaustion, their thoughts tangled with doubt. Where was Jesus now? Why had he sent them out alone? Then, in the darkest hours of the night, just before the dawn, something changed. One of the disciples squinted through the gloom, his eyes narrowing as he peered across the churning waves. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. There, moving across the water, was a figure. At first, it seemed impossible, a trick of the storm, a phantom conjured by exhaustion. But the figure drew closer, and the impossible became undeniable. A murmur of fear rose among them, low and urgent. "It's a ghost!" someone whispered, the words trembling with dread. Their hearts pounded, terror threatening to consume them. The figure continued to approach, its form steady and calm amidst the chaos of the waves. But then, a voice rang out, a voice they knew, a voice that pierced through the wind and the fear like a beacon of light. "Take courage! It is I. Do not be afraid." It was Jesus. The words settled over them like a warm embrace, soothing their panic and easing the tight grip of fear. The figure on the water was not a ghost but their teacher, their friend, the one who had filled their days with miracles and their hearts with hope. His presence, so unexpected and yet so familiar, wrapped around them like a protective shield. The storm still raged, the waves still churned, but something shifted within them. In that moment, they were no longer alone. Jesus was there. One disciple, Peter, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Jesus, his heart beating with a mixture of fear and boldness. He called out, his voice carrying over the wind, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus smiled, his voice gentle and sure. "Come!" Without hesitation, Peter swung his legs over the side of the boat. The cold water lapped against his feet, but he did not sink. Step by step, he moved across the surface, his eyes locked on Jesus. The waves rose around him, but they held no power over his faith in that moment. His heart soared. He was walking on water, held up by trust and the presence of his Lord. But then, the wind howled louder, and the waves seemed to grow taller. The reality of the storm pressed in on Peter's mind. He glanced away from Jesus, his gaze dropping to the swirling sea beneath him. Doubt seeped into his heart like icy water. Fear tightened its grip, and his footing faltered. He began to sink, the cold water rising around his legs, his waist, pulling him down. "Lord, save me!" he cried, his voice breaking with desperation. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, grasping Peter's with a firm, unwavering grip. He lifted Peter from the waves, his eyes filled with compassion and a gentle rebuke. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Together they walked back to the boat, the storm still raging but their path steady. As soon as they climbed back into the vessel, the wind ceased. The waves calmed, the sea smoothed to a glassy stillness, and an overwhelming peace settled over the waters. The disciples, breathless and wide-eyed, knew they had witnessed something divine. In the quiet that followed, their hearts were filled with awe. They knelt before Jesus, their voices low and reverent. Truly, you are the Son of God. The knight's fear melted away, replaced by a deep, unshakable sense of wonder and trust. They understood, in a way they never had before, that Jesus' presence transcended the storm. His power, his love, his care for them was not diminished by the wind or the waves. He was with them, even when they felt alone, even when fear threatened to overwhelm them. As the boat drifted gently toward the shore, the disciples sat quietly, the cool breeze brushing their faces, the steady lapping of the water a soft lullaby. They closed their eyes, the memory of Jesus' voice, his hand, and his calm presence settling deep within their souls. The storm had passed, but the lesson remained. When the waves rise, when the winds blow, when fear creeps into the heart, there is one constant: Jesus is there. He walks upon the waves, he reaches out with a steady hand, and he whispers into the chaos. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. And with that assurance they rested. The rain began to fall, a gentle patter against the wooden sides of the boat, a rhythmic reminder that even in the storm, peace can be found. And as they drifted into sleep, the sound of the rain, the memory of the calm sea, and the presence of their Savior cradled them in a blanket of comfort and hope. Chapter 5. The walls of Jericho fall. The sun rose quietly over the plains of Canaan, casting a warm glow across the horizon and painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The air was still, the kind of stillness that precedes something momentous. The land lay silent, waiting, as if it, too, was holding its breath. In the distance, the walls of Jericho stood tall and impenetrable, their thick stone faces reflecting the early light. They were a testament to human strength, built to guard the city from any who might dare to approach. Near the walls, a different scene was unfolding. The people of Israel, thousands of them, had gathered in the quiet of dawn. They were a people who had wandered the wilderness for 40 long years, sustained by the promises of their God. Now they stood at the edge of their destiny, a land promised to them long ago, a land flowing with milk and honey. The city of Jericho was the first obstacle in this new chapter of their journey. At the front of the gathered people stood their leader, Joshua. His eyes were fixed on the massive walls before them. They were formidable, daunting in their size and strength, but Joshua's heart held no fear. He remembered the voice of God, the instructions that had been given, and the promise that victory was not in his hands, but in the hands of the Lord. The night before, Joshua had encountered a divine figure, a warrior standing with a drawn sword. When Joshua asked if he was a friend or foe, the figure answered, "Neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Joshua had fallen to his knees in awe, his heart humbled by the realization that he was not alone in this battle. God himself was leading the way. Now, as the people waited, Joshua relayed God's instructions. They were strange, almost baffling. There would be no immediate battle, no clashing of swords or charging of warriors. Instead, they were to march in silence around the walls of the city. "We will march around the city once each day for 6 days," Joshua said, his voice calm and certain. 7 priests will go before the Ark of the Covenant, each carrying a trumpet of ram's horn. On the 7th day, we will march around the city 7 times. And then, at the sound of the trumpets, we will all shout. And the walls will fall. The Lord has promised it. The people listened, their hearts beating with anticipation and wonder. They trusted Joshua, and they trusted the God who had delivered them time and time again. The command was simple, yet it required a deep and abiding faith. The walls of Jericho were strong, but their God was stronger. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the procession began. The Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of God's presence, was carried reverently at the center of the assembly. 7 priests walked before it, holding their ram's horn trumpets. The rest of the people followed, their steps falling into a steady, synchronized rhythm. There was no sound except for the soft patter of feet on the dry earth, and the occasional blast of the trumpets, long and mournful, echoing against the walls. From atop the walls, the people of Jericho watched with a mixture of confusion and mockery. Soldiers peered down, their hands gripping weapons, their faces twisted in disdain. What kind of army marched in silence? What kind of battle plan involved circling the city like a slow-moving shadow? But the Israelites did not falter. They completed the circuit of the city and returned to their camp. That night, as they rested beneath the vast canopy of stars, the air was thick with expectation. The rhythm of their march had imprinted itself into their hearts, a melody of trust and patience. The second day dawned, and they marched again. One lap around the city, the sound of trumpets filling the air, the walls of Jericho looming unchanged. The third day followed, and the fourth, and the fifth. Each day, the same ritual. The same march. The same steady rhythm of feet and trumpets. Doubt tried to creep into their minds, whispering that the walls were too strong, that the plan was futile. But they remembered the stories of their ancestors, the parting of the Red Sea, the manna in the wilderness, the water from the rock. Their God was a God of miracles, a God who asked for faith even when the path seemed unclear. On the sixth day, the march continued, a steady progression of faith in action. The sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the walls of Jericho. The city still stood, its gates firmly shut, its walls unyielding. But the Israelites' hearts beat with hope. The seventh day was coming. When dawn broke on the seventh day, a sense of anticipation hung in the air like a mist. The people rose early, their eyes bright with expectation. This was the day of fulfillment, the day of promise. Joshua's voice rang out with authority. Today, the Lord will give us the city. Remember, we marched 7 times, and at the sound of the trumpets, we will all shout with everything within us. The Lord has spoken. They formed their ranks, the priests taking their place before the ark, the trumpets gleaming in the morning light. The first circuit began, their feet moving steadily, the trumpets blowing their low, haunting notes. The second lap, the third, the fourth, all in the same rhythm, the same faith-filled silence. With each lap, the air grew more charged, the expectation more tangible. The people of Jericho peered down, confusion giving way to unease. There was something unstoppable in the quiet determination of this strange procession. The sixth lap passed, and they began the seventh. The trumpets blew, their sound rising higher, more urgent. Hearts pounded, breaths quickened. They completed the seventh circuit and came to a halt. Then, for a moment, there was silence. The world seemed to pause, the wind stilling, the air holding its breath. Then, Joshua's voice rang out, clear and strong. Shout! For the Lord has given you the city! A roar erupted from the people, a shout of victory, of faith, of trust fulfilled. It rose like a wave, crashing against the walls of Jericho with a power not their own. The trumpets blasted, their sound mingling with the cries of the people. And the walls began to tremble. A low rumble grew into a roar as cracks splintered through the massive stones. Dust billowed into the air, and with a mighty crash, the walls of Jericho collapsed, folding in on themselves like paper. Stones tumbled, gates splintered, and the impenetrable fortress crumbled to the ground. The city lay open before them, its defenses reduced to rubble by the power of God. The people of Israel surged forward, their hearts filled with awe and reverence. The victory was not theirs, it was the Lord's. They moved into the city, not with pride, but with the knowledge that they had witnessed a miracle, a testament to what happens when faith meets obedience. As the dust settled and the sun climbed higher, the air was filled with the scent of promise fulfilled. The walls were gone, but the memory of that moment would stand forever, a monument to a God who breaks barriers, who calls his people to trust, and who brings down walls with the sound of faith. That night, as the Israelites rested beneath the open sky, the stars shimmered with the quiet assurance of a promise kept. The sound of the wind was soft, the distant echo of trumpets a lullaby of victory. And as they closed their eyes, the memory of falling walls and God's faithful presence wrapped around them like a blanket of peace. Chapter 6. Elijah and the Prophets of Baal. The day was warm, the kind of heat that settled heavy on the earth, shimmering in waves across the dry, cracked ground. The sky above was a vast expanse of blue, unbroken by clouds, for the land had seen no rain in years. The people of Israel, once a thriving nation under the guidance of their God, were now gripped by drought, desperation, and despair. The fields lay barren, the wells were dry, and hope was as scarce as water. The drought had not come by accident. The people had turned away from the one true God, lured into worshipping the false gods of their neighbors. The most prominent among them was Baal, a deity of fertility and rain. Under the rule of King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, the worship of Baal had flourished, while devotion to the God of Israel had faded like a shadow at sunset. In the midst of this spiritual drought stood a lone prophet, Elijah. His eyes, sharp and piercing, reflected the weight of his mission. He was a man of deep conviction, called by God to be a voice in the wilderness of disbelief. It was Elijah who had declared the drought 3 years earlier, a judgment from God meant to wake the people from their idolatry. And now, at God's command, Elijah had returned, ready to confront the darkness that had settled over the land. Elijah's heart was steady as he approached Mount Carmel, a place of rugged beauty overlooking the sea. Here, on this ancient mountain, a confrontation would take place, a battle not of swords and shields, but of faith and fire. The people of Israel gathered, drawn by curiosity, fear, and a flicker of hope that the drought might finally end. They filled the hillside, their eyes weary, their spirits parched. The air was thick with anticipation as Elijah called out to the crowd, his voice strong and unwavering. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." The people were silent. Their hearts were torn, their faith diluted by years of compromise. They longed for rain, for relief, for something to believe in once again. Elijah turned to the priests of Baal, who stood gathered in a cluster, their eyes filled with defiance. There were 450 of them, dressed in their robes, symbols of their devotion to a god made of stone and imagination. "Let 2 bulls be given to us," Elijah declared. "You prepare 1 bull for your God, and I will prepare the other for the Lord. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." A murmur swept through the crowd. It was a simple challenge, direct and clear. A test that would reveal the truth. The prophets of Baal agreed, their confidence unwavering. They took their bull, cut it into pieces, and laid it upon their altar. The altar was adorned with symbols of their God, built of stone and wood, the pieces of the sacrifice laid out with meticulous care. The sun climbed higher, casting shadows that stretched long and thin. Then the prophets began to call out, "Baal, answer us!" Their voices rose in a chorus, loud and insistent. They danced around the altar, their feet stirring up dust, their hands lifted high. Time stretched on, the minutes slipping into hours. The sun burned overhead, and the cries grew more frantic. But there was no answer. The sky remained silent. The altar remained cold. The only sound was the rustling of dry leaves, the whisper of the wind against the rocks. Midday came, and Elijah watched quietly. His eyes held no fear, only a calm assurance that his God was near. He spoke, his voice edged with irony. "Shout louder! Surely he is a God. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." The prophets of Baal shouted louder. Their voices grew hoarse, their movements more desperate. They slashed themselves with knives, their blood mingling with the dust. The sun blazed overhead, relentless and uncaring. The crowd watched, their hope fading, their hearts growing heavy. But still, there was no answer. No voice. No sign. Only silence. As evening approached, Elijah stepped forward. The air seemed to still, as though the very earth was listening. He called the people to gather around him, and they came, weary and expectant. The old altar of the Lord, long neglected and broken, lay in ruins. Elijah knelt and began to rebuild it, stone by stone, his hands steady, his heart full of reverence. He took 12 stones, 1 for each tribe of Israel, a reminder of the unity they had forgotten. He arranged the wood, carefully placing the pieces of the bull on top. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he dug a trench around the altar and gave an unusual command. "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." Water, precious in this time of drought, was brought and poured over the altar. The wood grew wet, the ground beneath it darkened. He commanded them to do it again. And again. 3 times they poured water, until it soaked the wood, filled the trench, and made the altar glisten in the fading light. Then Elijah stepped back. The crowd held its breath. The prophets of Baal were silent, their faces pale with exhaustion. The air was thick with expectation, the sun slipping low on the horizon. Elijah lifted his face to the sky, his voice calm and clear. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind held its breath. The shadows deepened. Then, suddenly, fire fell from heaven. A searing light pierced the sky, and a torrent of flames struck the altar. The fire roared with a force that shook the ground, consuming the offering, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. The heat was intense, the light blinding. The flames licked the air, a vivid, undeniable display of power. When the fire vanished, all that remained was scorched earth. The crowd fell to their knees, their eyes wide with awe and fear. The truth was unmistakable, etched into their hearts by the fire that had fallen from heaven. They cried out, their voices trembling, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The prophets of Baal stood defeated, their silence now louder than their earlier cries. The truth had been revealed. The God of Israel, the God who had led their ancestors, was still their God. He had never abandoned them. He had only waited for them to return. As the evening deepened, a cool breeze began to stir. Clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with promise. Elijah looked to the sky and smiled. The drought was ending. The land would be renewed, the earth would drink deeply of the rain, and the hearts of the people would be refreshed by the presence of their God. That night, as the first drops of rain began to fall, the sound of water mingled with the memory of fire. The people rested, the drought of their hearts quenched by faith restored. And as they drifted to sleep, the gentle rain whispered a truth as old as time: "The Lord is God. He is faithful. He is near." Chapter 7. The Healing of the Paralytic. The early morning light filtered softly through the narrow streets of Capernaum, casting long shadows across stone walls and dirt paths. The town was beginning to stir to life, merchants arranging their goods, children laughing as they played, the smell of freshly baked bread drifting through the air. There was a sense of anticipation that hung in the breeze, a quiet excitement, because word had spread quickly: Jesus was back in town. In a small, modest house, a growing crowd had already begun to gather. People jostled to get inside, eager to hear Jesus teach. His words were like fresh water to dry, thirsty souls, and the people clung to every syllable, their hearts drawn to his presence. They had seen him perform miracles before, healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, casting out demons, and the hope that he might do so again filled the room with an electric sense of possibility. The house was packed, every corner taken. People sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on Jesus. Those who couldn't squeeze inside leaned through windows, peering over one another's shoulders, straining to catch a glimpse of the teacher. The room was warm, filled with the quiet murmur of anticipation and the occasional creak of wooden beams under the weight of the crowd. Just outside the house, 4 men walked briskly through the narrow streets. Their faces were marked with determination, and their hands tightly gripped the corners of a makeshift mat. On this mat lay their friend, a man who had been paralyzed for as long as they could remember. His legs, thin and motionless, told a silent story of frustration and limitation. His eyes reflected both resignation and a flicker of hope, a hope ignited by the friends who refused to leave him behind. The 4 friends had heard about Jesus. They had heard of his power to heal, his compassion for the suffering, and the way lives were transformed by his touch. And in their hearts, a seed of belief had taken root. If they could just get their friend to Jesus, they were sure something miraculous could happen. Their faith was simple, but it was steadfast. As they approached the house, their hearts sank. The crowd spilled out of the door and into the street, a sea of people standing shoulder to shoulder. There was no way in, no path through the crush of bodies. They glanced at each other, frustration flickering in their eyes. But giving up wasn't an option. Their friend had spent his life watching opportunities pass by. Not this time. Not today. One of them glanced upward and then back at the others, a determined glint in his eyes. The roof. It was a flat roof, made of wooden beams covered with thatch, packed with clay. If they couldn't get through the door, they would go over it. Without hesitation, they carefully maneuvered their friend around the crowd and climbed the narrow stone steps at the side of the house. The effort was strenuous. Beads of sweat dotted their brows as they carried the weight of the mat. The paralyzed man clung to the sides, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. What were they doing? What if they fell? But he knew one thing for certain. He trusted these men with his life. Reaching the roof, they set the mat down gently. The sun was warmer up here, the air a little clearer. From this vantage point, they could hear the hum of Jesus' voice inside, each word rising through the ceiling like incense. There was no turning back now. They knelt and began to dig. Their fingers scraped at the hardened clay, pulling away handfuls of dirt and straw. The work was slow and painstaking, but their determination drove them forward. The crowd below began to murmur as bits of debris fell from the ceiling. People inside the house looked up, confusion and curiosity dancing across their faces. Finally, the hole was large enough. Sunlight pierced through, casting a beam into the dimly lit room below. The four friends peered down and saw Jesus standing there, his calm gaze meeting theirs. He didn't look surprised or annoyed. He looked expectant, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. Carefully, they tied ropes to the corners of the mat and began to lower their friend through the opening. The crowd gasped, parting to make room as the man descended. The house was silent now, the only sound the soft creak of the ropes and the shallow breaths of those watching. The paralyzed man's heart pounded. He was being lowered into the presence of the one who might change everything. He couldn't lift his head to see Jesus clearly, but he could feel his gaze, steady, compassionate, understanding. The mat touched the floor, and the friends above let out a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. They had done it. They had brought their friend to Jesus. Jesus looked down at the man, and then up at the faces peering anxiously through the hole in the roof. Their eyes shone with hope, with faith so tangible it filled the room like a fragrance. Jesus smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. He saw not just the man before him, but the love and determination of the friends who had refused to let obstacles stand in their way. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." The words hung in the air, unexpected and yet profoundly beautiful. Forgiveness. A deeper healing than anyone had anticipated. Some of the teachers of the law in the room began to murmur among themselves, their faces clouded with skepticism. "Why does this man talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew their thoughts. He turned to them, his eyes steady and filled with a quiet authority. "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He turned back to the man on the mat. The room was so silent now that the faintest breath could be heard. Jesus' voice was gentle but firm, a voice that carried the weight of divine power and boundless compassion. "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." For a moment, the world held its breath. The paralyzed man's eyes widened. A warmth spread through his limbs, a tingling sensation that gave way to strength. Tentatively, he bent his knees, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath him. He pushed his hands against the mat and rose, first to his knees, then to his feet. The crowd gasped, eyes wide, mouths open in astonishment. He was standing on legs that moments before had been lifeless. A grin spread across his face, tears streaming down his cheeks. He bent down, rolled up his mat, and clutched it to his chest. The weight of it, once a symbol of his confinement, was now a reminder of his freedom. The people erupted in praise, their voices lifting to the heavens, We have never seen anything like this." He turned and looked up through the hole in the roof. His friends' faces were streaked with tears, their eyes shining with joy. They had carried him here in faith, and now they watched him walk away, a miracle of grace and love. He stepped through the crowd, his heart light, his spirit free. The sky outside was clear and bright, the sun's warmth a gentle caress. Each step felt like a gift, each breath a reminder of new life. And as he made his way home, his soul echoed with the truth he now knew deep within. He was forgiven, he was healed, he was loved. Chapter 8. The Resurrection of Jesus. The world was still cloaked in the quiet shadows of early morning. The sky over Jerusalem was a deep indigo, the stars beginning to fade as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. A cool breeze whispered through the olive trees, brushing gently against the stone walls and narrow streets. The air felt heavy, laden with the echoes of the past few days, the anguish, the sorrow, the unimaginable grief. Just outside the city gates stood Golgotha, the hill that had witnessed the cruel and brutal end of hope, or so it had seemed. The cross, once a symbol of despair, now stood empty, its shadow long and cold. Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher, the healer, the one who had given sight to the blind and raised the dead, had been crucified. His followers were scattered, their hearts shattered by the weight of what they had seen. His body had been taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen, and placed in a borrowed tomb. A heavy stone had been rolled across the entrance, sealing away not just the body, but the hope that had burned so brightly in their hearts. Roman guards stood watch, their faces hard and impassive. The world had gone dark, and the silence was deafening. Yet, in the quiet shadows of the morning, something was about to change. A miracle was stirring, unseen and unstoppable. Death, which had seemed so final, was about to lose its grip. As the first rays of sunlight began to stretch across the land, a small group of women made their way toward the tomb. Their steps were slow, heavy with grief. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James. They carried spices and ointments, their final act of love and devotion for the one they had called Lord and Teacher. The path was rough beneath their feet, the sound of their sandals brushing against the dirt the only noise breaking the morning stillness. Their eyes were red from weeping, their hearts weighed down with sorrow. They hadn't yet grasped the fullness of what had happened. The cross, the nails, the crown of thorns, all of it was still too raw, too real. As they approached the garden where the tomb was nestled, a question lingered in their minds. Who will roll the stone away for us? The stone was large, impossible for them to move alone. But their need to honor Jesus drove them forward, even as uncertainty clouded their thoughts. They rounded the final bend in the path, and there before them stood the tomb. But something was different. The air seemed to shimmer with a quiet energy, a stillness that was not empty but expectant. The women stopped, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. The stone had been rolled away. They exchanged nervous glances, their hearts pounding. The entrance to the tomb gaped open, the darkness inside no longer sealed away. Fear and wonder swirled within them. Slowly, cautiously, they stepped forward, peering into the shadows. The tomb was empty. The linen cloths that had wrapped his body lay there, folded neatly, but the body of Jesus was gone. Their breaths caught in their throats, panic rising. What had happened? Where was he? Had someone taken him away? Suddenly, a light filled the space, a radiance so pure and dazzling that they shielded their eyes. Before them stood two figures, their robes gleaming like lightning, their presence both majestic and serene. The women fell to the ground, their faces pressed to the earth, trembling in fear and awe. One of the figures spoke, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." The words fell like soft rain on parched ground, soaking into their hearts, breaking open the fog of grief. He had risen. Could it be true? The memories rushed back, Jesus' words, his promises, the glimpses of a plan beyond their understanding. Tears filled their eyes, but this time, They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope, of wonder, of joy too great to contain. They turned and hurried from the tomb, their feet barely touching the ground. The world seemed brighter, the air clearer. The weight that had pressed down on them lifted, and in its place was a soaring sense of possibility. They ran to tell the disciples, their voices breathless and filled with excitement. "He is alive! The Lord has risen!" But when the disciples heard their words, they struggled to believe. It seemed impossible, like a dream or a cruel trick played by weary minds. Yet something stirred within their hearts, a spark of curiosity, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. Peter ran to the tomb, his heart pounding, his legs moving with desperate urgency. He reached the entrance, bent down, and looked inside. The linen cloths lay there, empty and silent. He stepped back, confusion and wonder mingling in his eyes. Something had happened, something beyond explanation, beyond reason. Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene remained near the tomb, her heart a storm of emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to comprehend what she had seen. She turned and saw a figure standing nearby. The early light cast shadows, and through her tears, she did not recognize him. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" the figure asked gently. Thinking he was the gardener, she replied. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Then he spoke her name, just one word, soft and familiar. "Mary!" Her breath caught. The world stood still. She turned fully, her eyes wide, her heart leaping with recognition. "Rabboni!" she cried, her voice trembling with joy. It was him. Jesus. Alive. Standing before her, the wounds of his suffering now marks of triumph. "Do not hold on to me," he said gently, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." She nodded, her heart overflowing. She turned and ran, her feet swift, her spirit soaring. The news that had once seemed impossible now pulsed with undeniable truth. Jesus was alive. Death had lost its power. Hope had been restored. The sun rose higher in the sky, its golden light spilling over the land, touching every stone, every tree, every heart with the promise of new life. The shadows of despair fled before the dawn, replaced by the warmth of a hope reborn. The miracle of the resurrection whispered a truth that would echo through eternity. Life is stronger than death. Hope is stronger than despair. Love has triumphed. And as the gentle rain began to fall, the world was washed clean, the drops like tiny reminders that in Jesus, all things are made new. The tomb was empty, but hearts were full. And as they closed their eyes that night, the sound of rain mingled with the memory of a voice calling their names, a voice that promised peace, joy, and a love that never dies. Chapter 9. Jonah and the Great Fish. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling port city of Joppa. The air was rich with the scent of salt and fish, mingling with the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, sails snapping in the breeze, and waves gently lapping against the wooden docks. Fishermen hauled in their nets, their faces lined with the stories of countless days spent at sea. In the midst of the noise and activity, a man hurried through the crowded streets, his steps quick and determined. His name was Jonah, a prophet of the Lord. His brow was furrowed, his heart beating with a mix of fear and defiance. He was running not from enemies or danger, but from a command given to him by God. The Lord had spoken to Jonah, instructing him to go to the great city of Nineveh, a city notorious for its wickedness and cruelty. God's message was clear. Jonah was to call the people of Nineveh to repentance, to warn them that their sins had reached the ears of the Almighty. But Jonah's heart was hardened. He wanted no part in bringing mercy to a people he despised. Nineveh was the enemy, and he wanted to see them face judgment, not forgiveness. So instead of heading toward Nineveh, Jonah turned his face in the opposite direction. He made his way to Joppa and found a ship bound for Tarshish, a distant place far away from God's call. He paid the fare, his hands shaking slightly as he handed over the coins, and stepped aboard. The wooden deck creaked beneath his feet, the scent of the sea filling his lungs. As the ship set sail, Jonah let out a breath, thinking he had escaped the mission, escaped God's presence. The ship drifted further from the shore, the waves gentle at first, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. Jonah descended into the belly of the ship, seeking a quiet place to hide, both from the crew and from his own thoughts. The sway of the vessel, the dimness of the hold, and the fatigue of his troubled heart soon lulled him into a deep sleep. But while Jonah slept, the sea began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, the wind picking up, cold and sharp. The waves that had once gently rocked the ship now swelled and crashed with a ferocity that made the timbers groan. The sky darkened, the first drops of rain striking the deck like cold needles. The wind howled, and the sea roared. A storm had descended upon them, wild and relentless. The sailors, seasoned men who had weathered many storms, sprang into action. Fear flickered in their eyes as they struggled to control the ship. They shouted orders, pulling at the sails, throwing cargo overboard to lighten the load. But the storm only grew fiercer, the waves rising like mountains, crashing down with a force that threatened to tear the ship apart. Terror gripped their hearts, and they cried out to their gods, their voices lost in the fury of the storm. Desperation clawed at them, a cold realization settling in: this was no ordinary storm. In the midst of the chaos, the captain stumbled below deck, his face pale, his eyes wild. There, he found Jonah, still asleep, oblivious to the storm that raged around them. "How can you sleep?" the captain shouted, shaking Jonah awake. "Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Jonah's eyes blinked open, the urgency in the captain's voice breaking through the fog of sleep. He felt the ship lurch beneath him, heard the roar of the storm, and a cold dread settled in his chest. He knew the storm was for him. The sailors cast lots, seeking to know who was responsible for this calamity, and the lot fell to Jonah. They turned to him, their eyes filled with fear and accusation. "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" Jonah's voice was low, his heart heavy with guilt. "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." The sailors' faces went pale. They understood now, the storm was no accident. Jonah had fled from his God, and now the sea itself was furious. "What have you done?" they asked, their voices trembling. The wind screamed, the waves threatened to crush the ship. Jonah looked at them, his eyes filled with resignation. "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." The sailors hesitated. To throw a man into the sea was to condemn him to death. They rowed harder, trying to bring the ship back to land, but the storm only grew wilder. They had no choice. They lifted Jonah, their hands shaking, their hearts heavy. "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life." Then, with one final effort, they cast Jonah into the sea. As soon as Jonah hit the water, the wind died down. The waves stilled. The storm was gone, as if it had never been. The sailors fell to their knees, awe and fear mingling in their hearts. They had seen the power of the Lord, and they offered prayers and sacrifices, their lives forever changed. Jonah sank beneath the waves, the cold water closing around him. Darkness enveloped him, the weight of his disobedience pulling him down. But God had not abandoned him. From the depths of the sea came a shadow, a massive, living form, silent and graceful. Before Jonah could understand what was happening, he was swallowed by a great fish. The world turned dark and damp, the air heavy and strange. He was alive, but trapped in a living tomb. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah sat in the belly of the fish. Time lost meaning. The darkness was complete, the silence broken only by the sound of the great creature's movement through the sea. Jonah's heart was filled with despair, yet also a strange sense of peace. He was alive, and where there was life, there was hope. From the depths of his soul, Jonah cried out to the Lord. His prayer rose like a song in the darkness, a lament and a confession, a plea and a promise. In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you. The Lord heard Jonah's prayer. Mercy flowed through the depths of the sea. The great fish swam toward the shore, its body moving with divine purpose. With a mighty surge, it rose from the water and vomited Jonah onto dry land. He lay there, gasping for breath, the sand rough beneath his hands, the sky wide and bright above him. He was alive. He had been given a second chance. The voice of the Lord came to him once again, gentle yet firm. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. This time, Jonah rose, his heart humbled, his spirit willing. He set his feet toward Nineveh, the city still waiting for a message of mercy. Jonah had learned that God's love was greater than his own understanding, his mercy deeper than the sea. And as the gentle rain began to fall, Jonah's heart was washed clean, his steps guided by grace. He had been in the depths, and now he walked in the light of redemption. The God of second chances had called him back to life. Chapter 10. Daniel in the Lion's Den. The air was thick with the warmth of a golden evening in Babylon, the city bustling with life beneath the grandeur of its towering walls and opulent palaces. The sound of voices drifted through the streets, merchants calling out their wares, children laughing, the rustle of robes and sandals on stone. The sky was painted in hues of amber and lavender as the sun slipped lower on the horizon. In the heart of this city, a man named Daniel walked with calm assurance, his face serene, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength. Though he was now an older man, his steps were steady, and his spirit was unwavering. For many years, Daniel had served faithfully as an advisor in the court of King Darius. His wisdom, integrity, and devotion to his God had earned him the king's trust and favor. Yet not everyone was pleased with Daniel's success. A group of officials, jealous of Daniel's influence and his favor with the king, plotted against him. They knew that Daniel's strength came not just from his wisdom, but from his steadfast faith in the God of Israel. They searched for a flaw in his character, a mistake in his work, but found nothing. Daniel was faithful in all things. But they knew one thing about him: he prayed to his God 3 times a day, without fail. A sly plan took shape. The officials approached King Darius, their voices smooth, their faces masked with false sincerity. "O King Darius, live forever! We propose that you issue a decree, for the next 30 days, no one may pray to any god or human except you, O king. Anyone who disobeys will be thrown into the lion's den." The flattery pleased the king. The idea of being honored as the sole focus of prayer for a month appealed to his pride. Without considering the consequences, he signed the decree into law. The seal was set, unbreakable by Persian custom. The news spread quickly throughout the city, a ripple of tension weaving its way through the hearts of the faithful. But Daniel, upon hearing the decree, did not falter. He returned to his house, climbed the stairs to his upper room, and opened the windows that faced Jerusalem. The evening breeze drifted through the open shutters, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant flowers. He knelt, just as he always had, and bowed his head. His heart was steady, his spirit lifted as he whispered his prayers to the God who had never failed him. His voice was soft, a thread of devotion woven into the tapestry of the evening. The officials watched from the shadows, their eyes narrowing in triumph. They rushed to the palace, eager to report Daniel's crime. Their words tumbled out, laced with satisfaction. "O king, Daniel pays no attention to your decree. He continues to pray to his God 3 times a day." King Darius felt his heart sink. He realized the trap that had been set, and his regret was deep. He respected Daniel, valued him, and now realized his own pride had placed Daniel in grave danger. The law could not be repealed, and his power, though great, was bound by his own decree. The king tried everything to save Daniel. He spent the day searching for a way to overturn the law, to find a loophole, to rescue his faithful servant. But by sunset, his efforts had come to nothing. The sentence had to be carried out. With a heavy heart, King Darius gave the order. The guards led Daniel to the mouth of a deep, dark pit, a den where lions prowled, their eyes glinting in the shadows, their low growls a reminder of the fate that awaited. The air was damp and thick with the scent of earth and fur. Before Daniel was lowered into the den, the king spoke, his voice strained with sorrow. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." The stone was rolled across the entrance, sealing Daniel inside. Darkness closed around him, the rustle of the lion's movements echoing in the stillness. The guards affixed the king's seal to the stone, ensuring that no one could tamper with it. Inside the den, Daniel's heart beat steadily. He could hear the soft padding of paws, the low rumble of the lion's breaths. Fear was a whisper in his mind, but faith was a shout in his soul. He closed his eyes and prayed, his heart lifting to the God who had always been with him. Meanwhile, back in the palace, King Darius returned to his chambers, but sleep would not come. The night stretched long and endless. He refused food and entertainment, his mind consumed with thoughts of Daniel. The hours crawled by, the weight of regret pressing down on him. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, the king rose, his heart pounding. He hurried to the lion's den, his robes brushing against the cold stone floor. The air was crisp with morning chill, the shadows still lingering in the corners of the world. When he reached the den, his voice trembled as he called out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" For a moment there was silence, a stillness that stretched into eternity. Then a voice rose from the darkness, calm and steady. "O King, live forever! My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I done any wrong before you, O King." Relief flooded the king's face, tears springing to his eyes. "Pull him out," he commanded. The stone was rolled away, and the guards lowered ropes into the den. Daniel emerged, his face serene, his body unharmed. Not a scratch marked his skin. The lions prowled in the shadows, their eyes calm, their mouths closed by divine command. King Darius marveled at the sight, his heart overwhelmed with gratitude and awe. He turned to the crowd that had gathered and declared with a voice that rang with conviction, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves, he performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." The people listened, their hearts stirred by the miracle they had witnessed. Daniel's faith, his quiet trust in the face of death, had become a testimony to the power and faithfulness of God. That night, the stars shone brighter over Babylon, their light soft and pure. A gentle breeze whispered through the city, carrying with it the promise of protection, of courage, and of a God who hears prayers even in the darkest places. And as Daniel lay down to rest, the memories of the lion's den faded into the peace of God's presence. The world was still, the night was calm, and his heart was filled with a faith that no storm, no trial, and no den of lions could ever shake. That brings us to the end of this journey through some of the Bible's most incredible miracles. I hope by now, you are feeling fully rested. Please do like this video and subscribe to our channel to help us grow the Word of God. Before we end, please let me pray over you. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that the words heard here in this video will enrich us, and reassure us of your care, power, and endless love. I pray for a peaceful, restful sleep for all those who are listening to this. Bless them, keep them in your care, and help them to sleep well. In Jesus' mighty name I pray. Amen. I wish you a peaceful and blessed sleep, and I'll see you soon. God bless you.